Joining us live is Michael Maher. He's the CEO of OnePassport. Michael, I understand you've been in talks with various governments about using your app. Just how hard is this going to be for Australians to navigate? We seem to have so many apps already. There's the International Air Transport Association app for international travel, which New Zealand is using. The EU has its digital green pass. Qantas is in trials on a number of apps. We have our vaccine passports here. It all seems very convoluted at this stage.
It is. Unfortunately, the government has decided to do a lot of this on their own. So there are a lot of talented players in Australian technology, from health certificates through to digital IDs, who've not been asked inside the tent. So the Australian government's come up with its own federal system, which is different to the state-based systems, as well as not connected to a lot of what's happening around the world, such as the IATA travel pass that Qantas has gone with, the EU pass, etc. There's probably about 30 major passes in the world, and the Australian government made their own one. So it'll be interesting to see how it's rolled out.
How do you think the rollout will go?
I think it'll work because it's part of something called the ICAR, the International Civil Aviation Organisation. So it's going to have a standard which will allow you to travel internationally. It's got a QR code on it, a proprietary QR code, so it needs a proprietary reader at the other side for someone to read it, but it means it's harder to forge. So harder than the green COVID certificate that we're using. The challenge is, as you say, we will probably need 4 or 5 different apps that all do the same thing, just in different situations, which is going to be frustrating for many of us, because each time you do it, you've got to go into Medicare or MyGov, which aren't the most friendly to use apps anyway, to download a verified copy of your certificate.
And that relates to not just international travel, but here in Australia, it's looking like we'll have different apps for every jurisdiction that we travel to interstate. Yeah,
it is very much looking like that. Everything has been siloed off. The government likes to silo things, and so we'll have a state-based app. So if you live in Victoria, called Service Victoria, Service New South Wales, which does both the check-in and it shows the green COVID certificate, which is different to the international certificate, which has been launched today. But then also there are industries like healthcare and aged care where we play, where with the OnePassport app, regulated workers have to carry those certificates anyway in order to do their work as a doctor or a carer, miner, school teacher, etc. So we're trying to see if they can consolidate some of the apps, or if you can use a work-based app where I've already got all of my immunisations to be able to travel domestically or check in at a pub or even go internationally. But at this stage, it still seems to be rather convoluted, and you will need multiple apps.
How open to rorting and fraud are these systems, do you think?
They're all different. So the federal government, the international travel one, has got a QR code on it, which is makes it quite difficult. Because it is that proprietary reader that you're required to use it, so the different immigration systems, it's quite hard to fudge. The domestic-based green COVID certificate that we've seen for a while now, that has 3 anti-fraud devices built into it, but they all freeze when you PDF it and export it. So if you freeze it into or you save it in your phone's wallet. So that's not too good. Now, the government knows that those security measures don't work once you export it, but they don't seem to have an appetite right now to fix them. I don't know why. No one seems to do it. I was just on a call this morning debating why they don't want to do it. Is it they like giving people something that they can have a tinker with to see if they can beat the man? Or is it they don't think it's a big enough issue? No one really knows. They're not very transparent with it. One of the challenges, though, is that until COVID, if you got a vaccination, one, it was written into a paper-based book, a little yellow book issued by the World Health Organization. And secondly, it was written in by hand. But after COVID, no one's going to be happy with a non-digital solution that isn't verified. So we hope that the government is going to open up access to the Australian Immunisation Register and other platforms like that, because hospitals and aged care homes and disability providers and schools, they're no longer going to be satisfied with someone coming in and handing over a piece of paper as evidence. But at this stage, the federal government's policy is that we don't share information, but I think they're going to have to move on that.
In terms of sharing information, it's not just the vaccination status, is it? I mean, the expectation is that before we jump on a plane, we'll also need to show proof of a negative COVID test before we're actually allowed to board. How will that all be wrapped in?
Correct. So we're moving from the first testing system we had was called PCR, which was the large ear bud up your nose and the back of your throat, which was then sent away to a pathology lab where they had to work, the pathologists worked on to expand it so they had enough that they could actually test for the antibodies. The rapid antigen test looks more like a pregnancy test, very different part of the body they test that. And it will be done at the airport typically, and it'll give you an answer in about 20 minutes. But if you're flying internationally, at this stage, you'll probably need to have one within 72 hours before flying. You might have to have one at the airport. Then you have one when you arrive, and you have one when you're coming home again. So you're probably going to have, for an international trip, 4 or 5 of these that you need to line up in a row as negative tests. So the system, you also need a system which you can track those, because somewhere along the way you might need to show evidence of that. And the Australian Immunisation Register is a bit of a misnomer. It's not an immunisation register because it only tracks vaccinations at this stage. So you need another system on your phone, OnePassport, for example, where you can actually save those test results to be able to produce them if called upon.
Michael Maher, we're all going to have to get our heads around all of this, aren't we? It's a whole new era coming up in terms of putting overseas again in particular. I appreciate you joining us to talk us through it. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure.